The unshakable gavel. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 7 swung open with a creak that echoed off the marble walls. Judge Carter Whitfield didn't flinch. He never did. After 26 years on the bench, there wasn't a single case, lawyer or defendant that could rattle him. His reputation stretched far beyond this Midwestern courthouse. He was known as a pillar of authority, a man whose rulings were swift, whose judgments were rarely overturned, and whose face held the same cold, unwavering expression whether he was handing down a fine or a life sentence. The courtroom itself seemed to embody his presence. Tall, oppressive wooden panels, a looming portrait of a long-dead Chief Justice, and pew-like benches where defendants and plaintiffs alike sat shivering under his silent scrutiny. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Carter Whitfield." Carter's footsteps echoed as he ascended to his bench. His black robe flowed behind him like a shadow, pooling at his feet as he settled into his high-backed leather chair. He barely glanced at the packed room. He didn't need to. The names, the charges, the faces, they were all the same to him. Names were paperwork. Faces were fleeting. Their stories, excuses, pleas, all irrelevant. Facts and instinct ruled here, and his instinct rarely failed him. Today was no different. At least, that's what he thought. The clerk handed him the morning docket. Carter's blue eyes skimmed the list, barely registering the names. Assault, fraud, possession, another parade of guilt. Then his eyes stopped at case number 14,387. Defendant, Nia Brooks. He frowned slightly, barely perceptible. Nia wasn't a name he saw often in these parts. It wasn't the name itself that gave him pause. It was the sharp contrast between that name and the small, conservative town he governed from the bench for over 2 decades. Names like Nia usually came with complications. People from elsewhere, from places whose residents didn't understand how this town worked. When Nia Brooks walked in, the murmuring of the room died almost instantly. She was tall, her dark skin a stark contrast to the pale, conservative crowd gathered for their slice of courtroom drama. Her navy suit fit her perfectly, not the cheap polyester blend favored by local public defenders, but something crisp, tailored, expensive. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, her face framed by thin gold-rimmed glasses, and her heels clicked with confidence as she approached the defendant's table. Carter's lip curled slightly, almost imperceptible. Too confident. He knew her type. Women who thought their education, their credentials, or their carefully cultivated poise would save them from the reality of this courtroom. Not here. Not in his court. The charges were read aloud. Wire fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice, the kind of charges he handled with routine disdain. The prosecutor, Lawrence Fitch, was a local fixture, a man with a thinning hairline, a predatory smile, and a talent for weaving complex crimes into simple moral failures. He was already smirking before he stood. "Your Honor," Fitch began, his voice oozing with self-satisfaction. "The defendant, Nia Brooks, stands accused of orchestrating a sophisticated embezzlement scheme, siphoning over $2.3 million from the charitable foundation she was hired to manage." Carter barely listened. His gaze flicked back to Nia. She stood perfectly still, shoulders squared, not a single tremble in her fingers as she rested them lightly on the defense table. Her attorney, Gregory Haynes, a semi-competent defense lawyer Carter had seen lose more cases than he'd won, was already sweating. This was going to be easy. "We will show," Fitch continued, "that Ms. Brooks used her position to funnel funds into shell accounts, personally enriching herself at the expense of the community she was hired to serve." Carter's fingers curled against the polished wood of his bench. A woman like her, stealing from honest people. It confirmed everything he believed. That these kinds of people took what they didn't deserve, talked their way into positions they were unqualified for, and then expected leniency when their greed was exposed. He didn't need to hear much more. Haynes stood, his suit wrinkled at the elbows. "Your Honor, we..." Carter waved him off. "Save it for your closing." Haynes' mouth opened, then closed again. He knew better than to argue with Judge Whitfield. The trial proceeded in a blur. Bank records flashed on a screen. Emails were read aloud, full of financial jargon and timestamps that blurred together. But Carter barely followed it. Nia Brooks didn't even flinch. That composure irked him. Her silence wasn't the panicked quiet of guilt. It was something else, something close to certainty. It took the jury less than 2 hours to deliberate. When they returned, Carter was already preparing the sentencing notes in his mind. Guilty, no doubt. It didn't matter how slick her lawyer tried to be, or how confident Nia looked in her suit. His instincts were never wrong. He knew criminals when he saw them, and he knew how to handle them. "All rise," the bailiff called. Nia stood. Carter's gavel felt cool in his hand as he prepared to bring it down, to seal her fate. 10 years. That would do. He would call it a deterrent, a necessary consequence for white-collar greed. The words felt comfortable in his mouth, even before he spoke them. "Ms. Brooks," Carter began, "in my 26 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such calculated and deliberate violation of the public trust. You use your position to exploit the very people you were entrusted to serve." He let the silence stretch, enjoying the weight of his own authority. "You are hereby sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole." The gavel cracked against the wood. Nia didn't even blink. There was no begging, no tears, no outbursts, just a calm, deliberate breath. And then something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, not fear, pity. As the bailiff approached to cuff her, the door to the courtroom opened sharply. 2 men in dark suits, both flashing badges, stepped inside. "Judge Whitfield," one of them called, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "We need to speak with you." "What is the meaning of this?" Carter demanded, rising from his chair. The taller agent held up a sealed folder, stamped with the official seal of the Department of Justice. "You just sentenced Assistant U.S. Attorney Nia Brooks, who has been conducting an undercover investigation into judicial corruption in this court." The room erupted. Gasps, reporters scrambling for their phones. The prosecutor's face turned ghostly white. Carter's hand tightened on the gavel, but suddenly it felt weightless. "What investigation?" His voice was sharp, but there was an edge of something else, something rare for him. "Fear." The agent stepped closer, setting the folder on Carter's bench. "An investigation into you, Your Honor." Nia turned her head, for the first time since the trial began, and met Carter's eyes directly. There was no smile, no satisfaction, just the quiet certainty of a woman who had been 2 steps ahead the entire time. "We'll be taking Ms. Brooks into our custody now," the agent said. The bailiff hesitated, looking between Carter and the agents. "Release her." Carter's voice cracked slightly, the gavel shaking in his hand. Nia stepped out of the bailiff's reach, adjusting the sleeves of her blazer as though she hadn't just been sentenced to a decade behind bars. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she walked past the judge's bench. "See you soon, Your Honor," she said quietly. Carter sank back into his chair, the weight of the folder on his bench feeling like a tombstone. For the first time in his career, the gavel felt too heavy to lift. When the robes fall away, Judge Carter Whitfield sat alone in his chambers, the heavy oak door locked behind him, shutting out the chaos echoing through the courthouse halls. His office, once a sanctuary of control, now felt suffocating. The walls seemed to lean in closer with every breath. The scent of leather-bound law books and faint cigar smoke, smells that once felt like power and legacy, now smelled like a funeral parlor. The file sat on his desk, unopened. The Department of Justice seal stared up at him, a silent accusation in gold and blue. His hands hovered over it, fingers trembling, knuckles gone white from the strain of holding it all together. This couldn't be happening. He'd ruled this courthouse for 26 years. He'd outlasted governors, district attorneys, and even federal oversight boards that had tried to rattle his grip. He was Carter Whitfield, untouchable. At least, he had been. Now the robe felt heavy across his shoulders. Not a symbol of authority, but a shroud. A knock rattled the door, followed by the hesitant voice of his longtime clerk, Marjorie Dean. Judge Whitfield. Her voice, usually sharp with efficiency, now wavered with unease. The press is outside. They're blocking the exits. Chief Judge Reynolds called. He's demanding you come to his office. Carter closed his eyes. Reynolds, the man who had toasted him at his 25th anniversary on the bench just last year, calling him a pillar of moral fortitude. What would Reynolds say now? More importantly, what would Reynolds do now that the feds were breathing down Carter's neck? He needed air. Ignoring Marjorie, he crossed the room, unlocked the private side door that led to the back staircase, and stepped into the dim hallway. His footsteps echoed against the tiled floor as he descended into the courthouse's lower level. The walls here were cracked, the paint peeling, a stark contrast to the grandeur above. It was the part of the building no one cared to maintain. Much like the defendants who shuffle through his courtroom every day. He stepped out into the rear parking lot, the autumn air sharp against his face. The momentary relief of fresh air was interrupted by the sight of two unmarked black SUVs idling by the curb. Feds. They were waiting. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. For the first time in years, Carter Whitfield had nowhere to go where his title could shield him. The phone call. Nia Brooks sat in a downtown hotel room, the soft hum of traffic filtering through the cracked window. Her phone sat beside her laptop, the screen alive with texts, emails, and missed calls. Reporters, former colleagues, even old law school classmates eager to cash in on the scandal, unfolding in real time. The once untouchable Judge Whitfield, a headline she never expected to see. Her hands were steady as she typed, documenting everything from her notes, every interaction, every bias-laden comment, every suppressed piece of evidence from her months undercover. This wasn't about revenge. This was about exposure, about ripping back the curtain and showing the rot beneath. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Normally, she'd let it go, but something in her gut, that honed instinct she learned over years of prosecuting corruption cases, told her to answer. She didn't speak first. Nia. The voice was rough, aged by stress and smoke, but unmistakable. Carter Whitfield. I wasn't sure you'd pick up, he said after a long pause. The arrogance, the courtroom swagger, all of it was gone. He sounded smaller, almost fragile. I shouldn't have, she replied, her voice cool but controlled. I need to talk, he said. Not as a judge, not as your accuser. As. He stopped, as though trying to find a word that didn't exist. As a man who's just realized how much he's destroyed. Nia leaned back in her chair, arms crossing over her chest. She didn't fill the silence for him. They gave me the file, Carter said. The one you and your team compiled. Every case, every biased ruling. Every time I cut a deal with the prosecution before a trial even started. You read it? She asked. I couldn't. His voice broke slightly. Not all of it. She let the silence stretch again. I thought. He took a shuddering breath. I thought I was protecting something. I thought I was holding the line against lawlessness. But I wasn't. I was just making myself king. Nia's throat tightened. She prosecuted dirty cops, corrupt mayors, and embezzling CEOs. But this was different. Whitfield wasn't confessing to escape the law. He was confessing because, for the first time, he'd been forced to see. What do you want, Carter? She asked, her voice softer than she intended. I want to help fix it, he said. If I go down, fine. I deserve it. But it can't just be about me. This whole courthouse, the way we've done things for decades, it has to be torn out by the roots. Nia stared out the window, watching the traffic blur by below. The idealist in her wanted to believe him. The prosecutor in her knew better. "Meet me tomorrow," she said finally. "Bring everything. Your notes, your old rulings, anything you're ready to put on the record. You'll talk to me." "I'll listen," she said. "That's all I'm offering." The line went dead. The Chief Judge's ultimatum. Carter stood in Chief Judge Reynolds' office, the dark mahogany walls suddenly feeling smaller than they ever had before. Reynolds, a lean man in his 70s with sharp eyes and a permanent frown, sat behind his desk. He held a folder identical to the one Carter had been given, the DOJ seal bright under the desk lamp. "This is bigger than you, Carter," Reynolds said, voice cold. "This touches the whole circuit." "I'm not the only one," Carter said, his throat dry. "There's a system here, the way we were trained, the expectations passed down. You think that'll save you?" Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "It won't." Carter's fists clenched at his sides. "So what do you want me to do? Lie? Pretend I didn't do exactly what they're accusing me of?" Reynolds leaned back, steepling his fingers. "If you testify, if you blow this open, you're not just taking yourself down. You'll take half the senior bench with you. Is that really what you want your legacy to be?" Carter took a long breath. "If that's what justice looks like, yes." Reynolds' lips curled into a thin smile. "Then you're a bigger fool than I thought." Carter turned to leave. "Do you really think people like Nia Brooks will forgive you?" Reynolds called after him. "You think confessing will make you the hero in this story? They'll rip you apart. The media. The defense lawyers you crushed. The families you destroyed. This town. There won't be anything left of you." Carter paused at the door. "Maybe I deserve that." And then, for the first time in his career, he walked out on a meeting with his chief judge without waiting for permission. The ghost of a marriage. When Carter returned home that night, the house was silent. Eleanor's suitcases were gone, leaving only faint imprints in the carpet where they had stood. On the kitchen counter sat a single envelope, his name scrawled across the front in her familiar handwriting. He didn't open it right away. He knew what it would say. "I can't do this anymore." He poured a glass of bourbon instead, but the familiar burn did nothing to dull the ache settling deep in his bones. The gavel that had made him king was now the same tool that would bury him. And for the first time in 26 years, Carter Whitfield had no idea what came next. Trial by fire. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the courthouse lawn when Carter Whitfield pulled into the parking garage, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were nearly translucent. The smooth concrete beneath his tires felt like it could give way at any moment, swallowing him whole. And maybe it should. His breath fogged the windshield as he sat there, unable to step out. He'd driven this route for over 2 decades, had parked in this same reserved spot. Chief Judge reserved, without a second thought. Now it felt stolen, borrowed, like the title was waiting to be clawed off the metal sign just as surely as it would be stripped from his nameplate before the week was out. The ringing of his phone broke the silence. Unknown number. His stomach churned. There was only one person it could be. Whitfield. "Judge Whitfield, this is Special Counsel Anthony Voss, Department of Justice Public Integrity Section." The voice was calm, confident, the kind of tone Whitfield used to have. The sound of someone who knew they controlled the room. "We need you to come down to our field office," Voss continued. "We'd like to have a conversation." Whitfield swallowed hard, but his throat was dry. "About?" "Let's not play that game, Judge," Voss said, almost politely. "You know what about." He glanced at his rearview mirror. 2 black SUVs were already waiting at the garage exit. Federal hounds, waiting for their prey. "I have a hearing at 10, Carter tried, knowing it was pointless. "No, Judge," Voss replied smoothly. "You don't." The line went dead. Carter's hands trembled as he set the phone down on the passenger seat. They were closing in faster than he'd expected. Press siege. The courthouse steps were already swarming. Reporters with microphones. Camera operators, live streamers broadcasting directly to thousands of angry faces across the country. Placards and signs waved above the heads of protesters. Justice for Nia. Unseat the racist judge. Accountability for all. Messages printed in bold, sharp lettering that cut through the chilly morning air like blades. Carter had seen plenty of courthouse protests over the years. Activists demanding leniency for defendants he'd thrown into prison. Families crying for second chances that he refused to give. He had always viewed them from above, from his third-floor window, sipping coffee with one hand while dismissing them with the other. Today, they were here for him. A shout rang out as someone spotted him exiting the side door, hoping to slip into the building unnoticed. There he is. Microphones jabbed toward him like spears, cameras flashing in rapid bursts, turning the air into a strobe-lit nightmare. Judge Whitfield, do you have any comment on the DOJ investigation? Did you knowingly target black defendants? Is it true you rigged plea deals? Do you regret sentencing Nia Brooks? The questions blurred into noise, a thundering wall of accusation. Carter lowered his head and pushed through, feeling the heat of their stares burning into his skin. His only defense was silence. As he reached the heavy wooden doors, a single voice cut through the chaos. Justice always comes home, Carter. He froze mid-step. Nia Brooks stood just inside the lobby, her arms crossed, her posture perfectly composed. Dressed in a deep gray suit, she looked every inch the federal prosecutor she was, and every inch the reckoning he had never expected to face. The DOJ meeting. The conference room at the DOJ field office was sterile, white walls, and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A small American flag stood limp in the corner. No mahogany, no leather chairs, just a steel table, 3 chairs, and a recorder that sat in the center of the table like a silent witness. Special Counsel Anthony Voss sat across from Whitfield, his expression polite but impenetrable. Next to him, a young woman with sharp eyes and a legal pad seemed to be writing every word Carter breathed. Judge Whitfield, thank you for coming, Voss said. His smile was disarming, but his eyes were calculating. We have quite a bit to discuss. Carter's fingers curled around the edge of the table, the skin stretched tight over his knuckles. I'm here to cooperate. That's refreshing, Voss said, because the evidence we have suggests you've spent the last 2 decades doing the opposite. Carter's stomach twisted. I want to make this right. We'll see, Voss said, sliding a thick file across the table. Let's start with your sentencing patterns. Carter didn't want to open it, but he did. Page after page of cold data stared back at him. Spreadsheets and tables documenting the racial breakdown of every defendant who had passed through his courtroom. Side-by-side comparisons of sentences for white defendants versus black defendants. The numbers didn't lie. Care to explain, Voss asked, why black defendants were 42% more likely to receive the maximum sentence in your courtroom, regardless of charge severity? Carter's throat tightened. He couldn't even summon his usual self-justifications. They sounded ridiculous even in his own mind. They were more likely to be repeat offenders. They didn't respect the court. They came from broken homes. Excuses crumbled in the face of the raw numbers. I can't, Carter said, his voice hoarse. Voss leaned back, hands folded across his chest. That's a start. The Chief Judge's ultimatum, revisited. Later that afternoon, Chief Judge Reynolds summoned Carter to his chambers. The room was empty save for the 2 of them. No clerks, no aides, no pretense. Just 2 aging men whose careers were entangled like vines, choking each other now that the light had hit them. I just got off the phone with the circuit court, Reynolds said. They want your resignation. Carter's stomach clenched. Effective when? Immediately. Carter swallowed hard. He'd known it was coming. Still, hearing it out loud felt like a death sentence. You're not walking out of here as a judge, Reynolds added, his voice softer than Carter expected. You'll walk out as a private citizen, a disgraced one. Carter braced his hands on the back of the chair. What happens if I refuse? Reynolds shook his head. Then they refer you for formal impeachment proceedings, public hearings, testimony from every defendant you've ever steamrolled, dozens of cases reopened, every ruling you ever made questioned. He gave Carter a long, hard look. Resign. At least then you control the narrative. Control. The word was almost funny now. I'll draft the letter, Carter said. No need, Reynolds said, sliding a prepared document across the desk. Just sign. The pen felt heavier than the gavel had ever been. The press conference. The lobby was packed. Reporters, activists, former defendants, they all crowded into the space where Carter had once walked with impunity. Now he stood behind a folding table, no bench to elevate him, no bailiff to clear the room. Cameras clicked. Lights glared. Microphones waited. My name is Carter Whitfield, he began, his voice trembling only slightly. For over 2 decades, I sat in judgment of others. Today, I stand before you to acknowledge the failures in my own judgment. The crowd stilled. Reporters leaned forward. My rulings were not always fair. My biases clouded my ability to see defendants as individuals. I allowed race, class, and personal prejudice to influence decisions that should have been rooted only in the law. A few gasps, a few quiet cheers. He glanced toward the back, where Nia Brooks stood with her arms crossed. No smile, no expression, just quiet observation. I am resigning from the bench, effective immediately, Carter said. I will cooperate fully with the DOJ investigation, and I will testify to the systemic bias I was a part of, not just mine, but the culture that enabled it. The room erupted in noise. Questions, shouts, accusations, but Carter only had eyes for Nia. She gave him the smallest of nods. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. And for Carter Whitfield, that was the only verdict that mattered. Beneath the robes. The press conference should have been the end of it. For Carter Whitfield, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, confessing his sins to a sea of lenses and notepads, it had felt like a form of sentencing. The final gavel strike on a career defined by self-certainty. He had imagined, foolishly, that admitting the truth would bring some kind of relief, a lifting of the weight he carried for years without ever acknowledging it. It hadn't. If anything, the weight had doubled. It was the phone calls that did it first, the ones from numbers he knew by heart. Judge Reynolds, D.A. Vaughn, Sheriff Clements, old friends, men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him at retirement parties and golf tournaments, now leaving messages cold enough to crack glass. Hope you're happy, Vaughn's voicemail said. You dragged all of us down with you. Sheriff Clements was even shorter. Traitor. There was no room for repentance in their world. Carter had broken the first rule. Never turn on your own. The DOJ's expanding net. The DOJ interrogation room had become a second home. Each day brought new agents, new boxes of files, and new names Carter had hoped to forget. We want patterns, Special Counsel Voss said, sliding a thick binder across the table. Not just your rulings. We want the whole culture. Who looked the other way? Who encouraged it? Carter's fingers traced the binder's edge. Inside were names, dozens of them. Fellow judges, prosecutors, clerks, even public defenders who had played along to keep their careers alive. I'm not the only one, Carter said softly, more to himself than anyone else. We know, Voss replied. That's why we're here. With shaking hands, Carter began to flip through the binder. The first name sent a cold shock through his chest. Judge William Reynard, the man who had been his mentor when Carter was just a rookie judge. Reynard, who had taught him how to streamline cases, how to read a defendant's worth at a glance, how to clean up the docket by pressuring public defenders into plea deals before they even saw the evidence. That's where it started, Carter said, barely realizing he was speaking aloud. Reynard told me the system wasn't built for fairness. It was built for efficiency. Voss leaned forward. And you carried that with you, didn't you? Carter swallowed. I thought I was keeping order. Order, Voss repeated, his tone sharp. "Is that what you called it when you sent black teenagers to state prison for shoplifting? When you ignored evidence tampering because it made your docket easier to clear?" Carter's hands curled into fists on the table, but there was no anger left in him, just shame. "Yes," he said, the words scraping from his throat. "That's what I called it." Voss didn't speak for a long moment. The only sound was the faint scratching of the assistant's pen as she documented every word. When Voss finally spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less relentless. "We're offering you a deal, Judge Whitfield. Full cooperation. You name names. You testify in public hearings. In exchange, we'll recommend reduced charges." Carter's stomach twisted. "And if I refuse?" "Then we go after everything," Voss said. "Your house, your pension, every case you've ever touched, all fair game." There was no choice, and they both knew it. "I'll cooperate," Carter said. The pen's scratching paused, as though the assistant was waiting for him to take it back. "I'll name every name," Carter said again. "Everyone. Old friends, new enemies." The news broke within hours. Leaks from the DOJ's office revealed that Judge Carter Whitfield was not just cooperating. He was naming names. By the evening broadcast, the phrase "judicial hit list" was already trending. It wasn't just the media that reacted. Carter's inbox, once filled with invitations to legal symposiums, charity galas, and judicial fundraisers, now overflowed with venom. "I hope you rot, you backstabbing piece of shit. You're a disgrace to the bench and the robe. You're not just taking yourself down, you're burning the whole house." One email stood out. It was from Judge Carolyn Dorsey, one of the few black judges in the state's circuit court. "You think confessing now will erase the lives you ruined. It won't, but at least it's something." The message was unsigned, but Carter knew her voice well enough from their rare interactions. She had stood in his courtroom once, years ago, watching silently as he dismissed her concerns about racial disparities in sentencing. He had waved her away, told her she was being emotional. He wondered if she would testify at his hearings. He hoped she would. The home front collapse. The house was silent when Carter returned. Eleanor's presence had always filled their home. The faint scent of her lotion, the classical music she played while cooking, the wine glasses left half full on the counter after long conversations. Now, every room felt hollow. Her note was still on the kitchen table. "I need space. I don't know who you are anymore. Maybe I never did." He'd read it a dozen times, but the words still struck like a hammer. She hadn't said divorce. Not yet, but the absence was louder than the word itself. His daughter Claire's texts were even shorter. "I can't believe you. Don't call me right now." Carter poured himself a drink, but it tasted bitter, the burn of bourbon mixing with the acid in his throat. His hand shook so badly he set the glass down, spilling amber liquid across the marble countertop. The man in the mirror above the sink was a stranger, grayer, smaller, hollowed out by the weight of what he finally let himself see. The first public hearing. The State House hearing room was larger than Carter expected. Rows of seats filled with journalists, activists, former defendants, even his own neighbors. The panel of state legislators sat at a long table, microphones gleaming under the lights. Carter sat alone. His attorney, a younger man with nervous eyes and a briefcase far too clean, had tried to coach him. But there was no coaching for this, no script for unmaking a career in public. The first question came from Senator Leela James, a rising star with a reputation for cutting through witnesses like a scalpel. "Judge Whitfield, for the record, how long did you knowingly apply racial bias in your sentencing?" The microphone amplified the dry swallow he couldn't suppress. "Since my first year on the bench," Carter said. Gasps rippled through the room. "And who taught you this system?" James pressed. "Judge William Reynard," Carter said. "He told me it was the way things worked, that it wasn't about race. It was about knowing who was going to cause trouble and who wasn't. And you believed him." Carter's jaw clenched. "I wanted to." "Why?" because it made everything easier. The silence in the room was louder than the clicking of pens. Nia's watchful eye. From the back row, Nia Brooks watched without expression. She was no longer a defendant in an ill-fitting pantsuit. She was the investigator who had set this collapse into motion, and the woman who would make sure it reached the foundation. She saw Carter for what he was, not a monster, but something worse. A man who could have done the right thing and chose comfort instead. He wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last. But at least now, the spotlight was on him. And with every word he spoke, the rot beneath the robe became clearer to the world. Collateral damage. The lights in the hearing room were uncomfortably bright, harsh enough to make Carter Whitfield squint as he sat at the center of the storm. His tie felt like a noose. His back ached from the rigid chair beneath him, but even discomfort felt like part of the punishment, the body reacting to the slow erosion of his power. The gallery was full again, a sea of familiar faces, reporters he'd ignored, defense attorneys he'd belittled, families of defendants whose pleas he had cut off mid-sentence. They were all here, watching, some with gleeful smiles, others with cautious hope. But the ones who haunted him most were the other judges, his colleagues. Judges who had once gathered for golf weekends and judicial retreats, who had shaken his hand and called him Carter like they were old war buddies. They sat now in the reserved row, arms crossed, faces grim, waiting for him to betray them to save himself. And he would, because survival was all that was left. Judge Whitfield, Senator Leela James' voice rang out, calm and authoritative. We'd like to enter into the record a series of communications retrieved from your official email account. The clerk carried over a thick binder, heavier than Carter expected. When it hit the table, the thud sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. These emails, James continued, detail conversations between you and various prosecutors, fellow judges, and law enforcement officers regarding pretrial agreements, racial profiling strategies, and the deliberate pressuring of public defenders to force guilty pleas. Carter's jaw tensed. He knew what was coming. They weren't just going to expose him. They were going to lay bare the entire rotten network. Every backroom conversation, every quiet understanding shared over steak dinners and brandy. This email, James said, lifting a page from the binder, is from Judge Daniel Ellsworth, sent to you and Judge William Reynard in March of 2014. It reads, and I quote, "If they come in with cornrows and a public defender, they're guilty. Let's move this along. The docket's full." The room went still. Carter could feel the weight of every eye on him. He could practically hear the sound of the blade being sharpened for his throat. "Is this the culture you referred to in your previous testimony, Judge Whitfield?" "Yes," Carter said, the word dry and thin. "It was the culture I learned. And you participated in it." "Yes." He didn't bother to look toward the judge's row. He could feel Judge Ellsworth's eyes boring into him, hot with rage and fear. They all knew what Carter's cooperation meant. Their secrets, their arrogance, their systemic bias, all of it was going to spill out like sewage into the light. Friends turned executioners. The courthouse conference room, once Carter's kingdom, was now his interrogation chamber. The DOJ team had settled in like they owned the place. Each day brought new files, new witnesses. It wasn't just Carter's cases under review anymore. The Public Integrity Task Force had expanded the scope. They were unraveling the entire network of complicit judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials across the district. Names that once commanded respect were now whispered like curses. Judge Ellsworth, Judge Helen Pratt, D.A. Vaughn, Sheriff Clements. Old friends, old conspirators. The same men and women who had sent holiday cards and toasted Carter's promotions were now lined up, one by one, to cut deals of their own, each throwing the others under the bus to save themselves. The betrayal file. The file that hit Carter's desk on the third day made his stomach churn. Judge Reynard's affidavit. Reynard, his mentor, The man who taught him how to read a defendant's value based on their shoes, their slang, the way they slouched in the defendant's chair, had flipped. His sworn statement was a detailed confession of the Judicial Culture Club, a web of back-channel deals, racial profiling techniques, and unwritten rules passed down through the ranks. If the defendant's family didn't show up, they were guilty. If they were represented by a public defender, they were already lost. If they couldn't afford bail, they belonged in a cell. Carter's name appeared 57 times in Reynard's statement, a testament to their close professional bond. Reynard painted him not as a victim of culture, but as an enforcer of it, the trusted right hand. When Carter finished reading, his hand shook so violently the pages fluttered onto the floor. Nia Brooks, the face of the reckoning. From the second-floor window of the DOJ field office, Carter could see the crowd gathered on the courthouse lawn. They were no longer just protesters. They were organizers, families holding framed photos of sons and daughters sentenced in Carter's courtroom, defense attorneys with reopened case files in hand, reporters broadcasting live feeds to tens of thousands of outraged viewers. And in the center of it all stood Nia Brooks. She had become the face of the movement, not because she sought attention, but because her story was too irresistible. The black federal prosecutor railroaded by a racist judge who turned the system upside down to clear her name. Her composure never wavered. Whether she was speaking to CNN or hugging a tearful mother whose son was serving a 15-year sentence for possession, she embodied grace and resolve. Carter watched her through the glass, remembering the first time he saw her, standing before him in her gray suit, calm and deliberate, while he sentenced her to 10 years without so much as considering the evidence. He had thought she was arrogant. Now he knew better. She was unbreakable. The personal cost. The house was empty when Carter returned each night. Eleanor hadn't called in weeks. Their daughter Claire had blocked his number after his first public hearing. The silence was profound, the kind that seeped into the walls and floors until the whole house felt haunted. The photos in the hallway, Carter shaking hands with governors, standing beside retired Supreme Court justices, smiling with fellow judges, all felt like portraits from a different life. A man who didn't exist anymore. He tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. He saw the faces of the men and women he had sentenced without mercy, not the guilty, but the assumed guilty. Young black boys in oversized suits, mothers pleading for leniency, fathers trying to explain how a moment of desperation had led to a decades-long nightmare. He had called them criminals. They had just been people. The case reopens. On the 6th day, the DOJ notified Carter that they were reopening 183 of his cases for formal review. Defense attorneys were filing motions for new trials, citing racial bias, prosecutorial misconduct, and judicial prejudice. Carter's signature was on every case file. "This is only the beginning," Special Counsel Voss told him during a break in his deposition. "You're the first domino. The whole damn system is coming down." Carter's mouth was too dry to respond. The private meeting. The last person Carter expected to see was Nia Brooks, standing in the doorway of his stripped-down office. No nameplate, no personal photos, just a room waiting for a new occupant. "I didn't think you'd come," Carter said. Nia stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I wanted to see for myself." "See what?" "If you actually understood what you did." Carter swallowed hard. "I do." "Do you?" Her voice was calm, but there was no forgiveness in it. Because understanding means realizing you didn't just ruin careers, you ruined lives. People lost their children, lost their homes. They died in prison because of you. The words cut deeper than any gavel strike. "I can't undo it," Carter said quietly. "No," Nia agreed. "You can't." She turned to leave but paused at the door. "But you can tell the truth. Every time they ask. Every time they put a microphone in front of your face, you say it out loud. No spin. No excuses. I will." She didn't look back. "We'll see." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Carter alone with the ghosts he had created. The weight of judgment. The federal courtroom was filled to capacity. Carter Whitfield sat at the defendant's table, the table where defendants once sat trembling under his gavel. Today, there was no robe, no elevated bench, no audience rising when he entered. No murmured, "Your Honor," only silence, except for the muffled click of cameras capturing the final chapter of his fall. The United States v. Carter Whitfield was no longer a local scandal. It was a national spectacle. News outlets from across the country had descended on the courthouse, describing him as the face of systemic bias and judicial corruption. On the prosecutor's side sat Nia Brooks, no longer in handcuffs, no longer forced into silence. Her sharp navy blazer cut a clean line, and her posture radiated authority. Not just a survivor, but a symbol of the reckoning she had ignited. Carter couldn't meet her eyes. The judge presiding over his case was Judge Carolyn Dorsey, one of the few black judges in the state's history, and one of the first to challenge Carter's sentencing practices years before. He had ignored her then. Today, she held his fate in her hands. "Mr. Whitfield," Judge Dorsey said, her voice clear, the weight of justice heavy in every syllable, "you've pleaded guilty to conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial power." "Yes, Your Honor," Carter said, his voice hoarse. "Before sentencing," she continued, "do you have anything to say?" He stood slowly, feeling the weight in his knees. For a moment, the words stuck in his throat, too clogged with years of arrogance and denial. But then they came, one after another, like floodwaters breaking free. "For 26 years, Carter began, I sat in judgment of others. I believed I was maintaining order, upholding the law. I told myself I was protecting the community." He paused, his fingers tightening against the edge of the table, knuckles bone white. "But the truth is, I wasn't protecting anyone. I was protecting myself, my comfort, my power. I made assumptions about defendants based on the color of their skin, the way they dressed, the accents they spoke with. I silenced attorneys who challenged me. I dismissed evidence that didn't fit my narrative. I destroyed lives." The silence in the room was suffocating. Nia's expression was unreadable, but her eyes, those sharp, unforgiving eyes, never wavered from him. "I deserve what's coming," Carter said softly. "And I hope, somehow, the people I hurt get a fraction of the justice they were denied." He sat down, shoulders slumped, the gavel that had once felt so comfortable now replaced by cold metal cuffs around his wrists. The sentencing. Judge Dorsey's face was unreadable, though her hands were perfectly still as she turned the pages of his file. "Mr. Whitfield," she said after a long pause, "you've admitted to participating in a culture of systemic racism and judicial bias that deprived hundreds, if not thousands, of fair trials. You used your position not to dispense justice, but to entrench inequality." Carter's heart pounded in his chest. "The court recognizes your cooperation in exposing a larger network of corruption," Dorsey continued, "but cooperation does not erase the harm you caused. It does not bring back the years stolen from innocent men and women." She glanced toward Nia. Carter's stomach twisted. "This court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison." The word struck harder than any headline, any news story. There was no negotiation. No appeal. The gavel fell, and Carter's fate was sealed. Behind the bars he built, the federal intake facility was cold and impersonal, its gray cinderblock walls a stark contrast to the mahogany panels of his old chambers. The guards didn't recognize him, or if they did, they didn't care. He was processed like any other inmate. Stripped, photographed, fingerprinted. The orange jumpsuit was scratchy against his skin, the fabric heavy with history. The same uniform he had condemned so many men to wear without a second thought. In the holding cell, Carter sat on a metal bench, his back against the wall. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead matched the ringing in his ears. Around him, younger men, black, Latino, white, glanced his way, some with curiosity, others with recognition. The judge, the racist, the fallen king. No one spoke to him. He didn't deserve their words. The metal door slid open, and the guard called his name. Whitfield. He stood, joints aching, and followed the man down the corridor, past rows of cells, rows filled with men who had once stood before him. Some wrongfully convicted, others handed harsher sentences because of the biases Carter had denied for so long. Their eyes followed him. Some smiled. Some didn't. He didn't blame any of them. Nita's fight beyond Carter. The story of Carter Whitfield's conviction wasn't the end for Nia Brooks. It was the beginning. Her story had become a national rallying cry, a case study in how deeply bias infects every corner of the justice system. But Nia wasn't content to be a symbol. She had work to do. In the months following Carter's sentencing, she led the Equal Justice Project, a national initiative dedicated to reviewing cases impacted by judicial bias. With funding from civil rights organizations and private donors, her team assembled a small army of attorneys, data analysts, and investigators, all focused on one goal: reopening every case touched by Carter Whitfield and his network. It was exhausting work, combing through decades of records, searching for patterns of misconduct and racial disparities. Each file told a story: a father separated from his children, a teenager's future crushed under the weight of a mandatory minimum, a mother denied bail because her public defender never stood a chance. Nia carried those stories with her. They fueled her. They made her unstoppable. Her face appeared on panels, in documentaries, on the covers of magazines profiling the new faces of justice reform. But the attention didn't matter. The work did. She stood on courthouse steps across the country, side by side with men and women whose convictions were being overturned, lives given back, piece by painful piece. Carter Whitfield had become a cautionary tale. Nia Brooks was becoming a force of nature. Letters from Cell 48. The first letter arrived 6 months into Carter's sentence. The envelope was plain, addressed to Nia Brooks, Esquire. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Carter Whitfield. Inside, the letter was short. Ms. Brooks, I know nothing I say can undo the damage I caused. To you, to the people who stood in my courtroom, to the families I shattered. But I need you to know, you forced me to see myself for the first time. Not the man in the robe, just the man underneath. I hope you never stop doing what you're doing. And I hope one day there's no need for women like you to fight so hard for something that should have been there all along. Respectfully, Carter Whitfield. Nia read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it in her desk drawer. She didn't respond. Some things didn't deserve closure. Some wounds needed to remain open, so the light could get in. Legacy and loss. The prison yard stretched out under a dull sky. Carter walked the perimeter alone, footsteps slow, hands clasped behind his back, the same way he used to walk the hallways of his courthouse. He no longer expected recognition or respect. Inmates ignored him. Guards barely spoke to him. He was nobody. He was free. For the first time in his life, Carter Whitfield knew exactly what that meant. The system begins to crack. In the months after Carter's sentencing, the Equal Justice Project succeeded in overturning 67 wrongful convictions, men and women whose freedom had been stolen by a system Carter had upheld and enforced. His name was invoked in hearings and protests across the country, not with anger, with purpose. The judge who built the wall had unwittingly handed them the sledgehammer, and with Nia Brooks leading the charge, they were just getting started.